Palliative Care Week 2020. My name is Joan Ryan and I'm a palliative care nurse consultant and member of Palliative Care New South Wales Executive. We're conducting a series of conversations during Palliative Care Week to celebrate and explore this year's national theme of palliative care. It's more than you think. And I think it's an absolutely wonderful theme to work with throughout such a year of change, highlighting the devastating bushfires, the uncertainty of the COVID pandemic of 2020, and where palliative care sits within those perimeters. Palliative care embraces whole person care, but that care doesn't stop at death. So today we've invited Michael Dash and Patricia McLoughlin along to talk about their work as a bereavement counsellor.
So my name's Michael Dash. I'm the coordinator of the Sydney Local Health District Bereavement Counselling Service. I've been doing this in various hospitals and places for about 20 years, and I've got a background in teaching and counselling and some work in community health and also in local government as well. And as I say, the last 20 years bereavement counselling are associated things. So the Sydney Local Health District Bereavement Counselling Service sits within palliative care. We're a counselling service that sees adults, we are a free service, and we work off self-referral. So the self-referral part is very important because it means that people can actually call us directly should they feel the need for bereavement counselling and come in to see us. It also means that staff can ring us and talk to us about the bereavement needs as they see them for their patients and families. But we'd always ask staff then to go back to the families and talk to them about the service and ask that particular person to give us a buzz to make a time to come in and see us. We're three people, myself and my colleagues, two part-time workers. We see people at Concord and RPA hospitals, and we usually see people face-to-face, or at the moment, of course, more via telehealth, and our sessions go for about 1 hour.
So I'm Patricia McLoughlin, and I'm one of the part-time bereavement counsellors for Sydney Local Health District. I've been in this particular role for just coming up to 6 years, and prior to that I did work in pastoral care and also for many years in drug and alcohol education and treatment. I think I'll just say a little bit about what a typical day is for a part-time bereavement counsellor, and it's often quite full. It would include doing the standard sort of administrative and email statistic keeping tasks that most frontline clinical work involves, without secretarial support, I might say. And mainly my day consists of seeing people one-to-one in a counselling room, and also speaking on the phone to either potential clients or to other staff within the district, other healthcare workers, a little bit about what we do, what we can offer, and what we can't offer.
I'll just add another couple of things, particularly for staff who might be watching this. We have two different sort of follow-up systems. One is for people known to the palliative care team, whether it's at Lifehouse, at RPA, Concord, or in the community. That includes a letter that goes out to at least the next of kin within the first 6 weeks following a death. We also run 2 memorial services throughout the year, one at Concord, one at RPA. They're of course on hold at the moment. And we send an anniversary letter as well, about 4 or 5 weeks before the death. So that's for all next of kin identified by the palliative care team to us. But the second group of people that we see or are available to are just the general public, people out there in the community where any sort of death might have occurred in our district as well. So it might be a heart attack, it might be a road accident and so forth and so on, up to and including suicide as well. We still work off self-referral for those people. Of course, there can't be any follow-up because we don't know them until they call us. And most of our referrals would come from, say, community, from GPs and so forth. And then the system works exactly the same for them. They just give us a call and we can then see them over a period of time.
But I think too, anything that says this person's life mattered.
Yes.
You know, even though they may not have had a public profile, they may not have had any recognition in their external life, they mattered, their life mattered.
Just moving on to some thoughts. I mean, there's a lot been written about bereavement and grief and loss for generations and generations through literature and art and everything, but it comes to mind that C.S. Lewis's comment that grief, no one told me or warned me that grief would hurt so much, that we would have so much fear. It would feel like fear. I'm just wondering what thoughts you might have around that in your work.
Thanks, Joan. Yeah, it's a very famous book, and especially amongst bereavement counsellors and people who are grieving, it's one of the go-to books, and it still speaks as truly as it did when it was first written. It's actually called A Grief Observed is the name of the book, and it's about the death of his wife, who he'd been married to for about 3 years. His first name was Helen, so in the book you see her referred to as H, although Joy was her common name. They're only married 3 years. And it took C.S. Lewis a long time to get to the, can we say, the intimacy of emotions and marriage to get to that. So it meant a great deal to him. So a couple of things I think we can easily pull out of there. One is the name of the book. It's A Grief Observed. So while he makes generalisations about grief and about how it affects human beings, he's also referring to his own specific grief. And it's such a clue for us working in this area around grief pre or post-death. That when people walk through the door, they come in as individuals, but they bring their whole life with them. They don't come as single issue individuals. We've never met a single individual issue client in our lives. So A Grief Observed. And nobody told me it felt so much like fear. But he goes on to say, but it's not fear. He says the sensations are like fear. So he goes on to say, I think, a fluttering in the stomach. He says it's like a blanket has been put between him and the rest of the world. He talks about yawning a lot, which is a very classic physiological response to anxiety. So in our language, we might begin looking at, what's his level of anxiety about what's going on for him. And for C.S. Lewis, being a particularly religious man, this death of this person he loves so deeply, dying after 3 years, called his faith into question. And so a lot of his grief was about the loss of his belief system. So it's an existential search for meaning, along with all the expressions of grief. And one of the things that troubled him was that grief is so involuntary and so repetitive. It's very hard to predict when an acute episode of grief is going to come up. I mean, sometimes we can predict the approach of an anniversary, a birthday, that type of thing. But it can have its own life. And that life can feel like a tidal wave building and then crashing over us. And so for somebody as thoughtful and intellectual and ordered as C.S. Lewis, I suspect that was really, really challenging. So this question of what's the point of life now? Now, existential sounds like a very big word, and it's one to grapple with, but all it means is it's talking about meaning. So people will commonly say to us, what's the point of getting out of bed? There's an existential question. C.S. Lewis talks about losing interest in the world. Things of the world didn't interest him. Although he actually did want to have people around him talking, he just wanted to be in amongst them, but not drawn into it. So he talks about loss of interest, inability to concentrate, really not being quite present. So he still needs connection, but it's a sort of connection where he can be protected and feel a little safer within himself as well, even though he's lost his way in life. I guess we should go to the take-home message from C.S. Lewis, which is after a period of time he did reaffirm his faith, but it was a very much changed faith. And he says, and I'm going to misquote him very badly, I think, he says something like, the pain he feels now is a reflection of the joy that he had and the happiness that he had, and he feels gratitude for what he's had. But that doesn't take away the pain. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that almost duality of grief, that we can re-engage with the world, but the pain doesn't necessarily go away. It's like life grows up around the wound. The wound doesn't necessarily get smaller, I don't think, in a sort of a way. It's that we learn how to re-engage with life, as most people will do.
Patricia.
I think just while I think of it, I might mention another book that I find very helpful and often lend to clients. And there's many books out there, so I'm just going to mention another one. And that's by Joan Didion, an American writer. It's called The Year of Magical Thinking. And it is really focused on people who have lost a life partner. But I think much of her observation, and again, she's a very skilled writer, as is C.S. Lewis, and I think that too, it does just bring to mind the universality of death, that it is there for all of us, and a grief observed rather than my grief observed gives us just that clue to this is the universal grief, the universal experience of loss after attachment loss, after the love of a person or an object. Yeah.
Patricia, what are some of the common issues that you come across on a day-to-day basis? Things that resonate across a lot of situations.
Yeah. So I think one of the big things that I find, particularly in the first maybe couple of sessions when I'm meeting someone, is the kind of the sort of wanting to be reassured or wanting to be told that what they're feeling is normal. And normal's a word I kind of grapple with a bit. I think it's really the cycle on the washing machine, but you know, it is useful. But people kind of think that perhaps they're going crazy, you know. I'm feeling these feelings I've never felt before, you know, I'm depressed, and grief is very like depression, but it's actually different. But you know, we won't necessarily go there at the moment, just to make that distinction. But this idea that there's this kind of great range, or an umbrella, if you like, of reactions or experiences that come after death, and I think Michael's already kind of, you know, alluded to the fact that these are physical, physiological, they're emotional, and they're also spiritual. And you know, the questions of you know, what's happened to my person, you know, where are they, where is the essence, where is the person that was my person? You know, I know they died, I saw the body, I was there perhaps at the final breath, we've had the funeral, you know, we saw the coffin buried, or we saw I've got the ashes, but where are they? Where's the person? And, you know, even if people are not religious or spiritual, these questions arise, and I think that, you know, if we can sometimes just allow those questions to be asked. I mean, I'm here to tell you there are no answers, but it's a damn fine conversation. And, you know, the other question I think too that people say, well, when will I stop feeling this intensity of feeling? You know, will it be 3 months? Will it be 6 months? Will I just wake up one day and the switch will have flicked and I'll be my old self? I'll be how I used to be. And I think, you know, the message, and it isn't what people always want to hear unless we drill down into it a little bit further, is you will never be the person that you were before this death occurred. Death has changed you. Death changes us. It you know, mixes us up, it melts us down, it reforms us. And we will never be exactly the same person. Our essence will be there. We will retain who we truly are at our core, but we will be slightly configured, if you like, in a different way, slightly differently. We will view meaning, we will view purpose differently.
Yeah, so the relationship, this feeling of relationship continues every single day that we wake up, but every single day that we wake up, we have to almost relearn the truth that the person A has died, and B, that this is permanent or they're not coming back. People talk about this in a whole variety of different ways. In fact, C.S. Lewis says something like the same leg breaks every day. You know, in fact, we wake up to it again. So, for example, a very typical, a common example, somebody wakes up in the morning, if say their partner's died, and they hear a noise in the kitchen and they think, oh, that's so-and-so getting me a cup of tea. And of course, within a couple of seconds, we relearn the truth of the loss. And of course, in these early days and months, there's an acute response to grief, which does tend to moderate over time as we take on board in all sorts of ways, socially, intellectually, emotionally, that this is ongoing, that we start to reintegrate and reconstruct. But it does have to almost be relearned, damn it, you know, every day, because it comes in from the inside.
And I guess the other sort of broad group of issues that come up in slightly different forms are the practical things. And often the thing that people are finding really difficult is their friends or families' sort of ineptitude. You know, they know that these people mean well. They know that they're trying to be comforting, consoling. But often, because we're not very kind of literate at dealing with grief and loss to do with death, you know, we don't know quite what to say. And unless we've actually experienced it ourselves and we've perhaps reflected on what is helpful and what is less helpful, we often kind of blunder, or they feel that their friends have kind of blundered into this space.
So who then benefits most from bereavement counselling? If this is a process or something that we go through and that is a normal thing, a normal reaction, who then benefits most from having bereavement counselling?
Can I give you a simple sentence to start with? Those people who think they will benefit from bereavement counselling, which is why we work off self-referral. Because, we're in the past, and certainly even now, we have very, well-meaning health professionals giving us a call because there's an acute episode of grief that looks strange or worrying to that health professional, and by all means they should give us a call too. However, that doesn't necessarily translate across time to say that person needs to come in for bereavement counselling. And Patricia and I were talking about this before and really wanting to strongly make the point that, 90% of people with their family, friends and so forth will manage okay, although it's a difficult managing. But it's the other 5-10%, particularly those who identify as needing it, that will do well. So it may well be that when somebody tells us about what they're experiencing, we might go, well, that's not very much. But the way it feels to them on the inside and the effect that's having on their life is what tells them, yes, I need to come along and see somebody.
And a lot of referrals I hear, people say, I want mum to have bereavement counselling, she needs it. And it's that sense of the other person.
Uncomfortability, and I think also too at the actual, bedside when the death has just occurred, family members or friends, have this great visceral outpouring of grief, which might be wailing and tears and the people, the healthcare workers or the people who aren't wailing and, expressing in that very emotional way are kind of going, oh dear, we can't deal with this, mum's out of control. We need to get someone to kind of dampen her down. Well, this is probably an acute response. It's not going to go on. And if it goes on for a long time, then yes, obviously that person does need some help. But, as Michael says, probably 10%, maybe 15% of people in the statistics, in the literature, the research that's been done suggests that that's about the number of people, because they've got underlying issues perhaps already of anxiety or abandonment or attachment issues, that are deep-seated, because the death's been sudden or traumatic. So a motor vehicle accident,
suicide.
A suicide, a heart attack where you're the person who comes out home and finds your partner dead on the floor, that's pretty traumatic. So often this sort of grief, or this kind of set of circumstances will benefit from a little bit of unpacking, a little bit of witnessing by the counsellor of what the person's feeling. And sometimes I've heard the bereavement space kind of referred to as a kind of a dedicated hour where you're taken seriously, where your grief is listened to. You get a sort of a dose of some kind of tonic, if you like, because it's witnessed, it's acknowledged. Your life matters, their life matters, your relationship mattered. And then, obviously the kind of techniques that we would then move on to assist people to kind of move. And I think that expression, move on, well, you've got to move on. You wouldn't want he wouldn't want you to be stuck here. I think just those small prepositions, moving on, suggests you're leaving behind. You're somehow betraying. You're being disloyal. But if you put another little preposition in there, move on with. Move on with all the things that, you got from being in that relationship with that person, all the legacy that you're left with of what that relationship meant. You move with it. You take it with you. You don't dump it and leave it behind. It goes with you.
You can't not take it with you because it's embedded. The longer you've known the person, the more complex, the more time you spend together, the more it means to you. You absolutely carry that with you. It is part of who we are. And one of the very challenging things for people that when we see them, just to take that a bit further maybe, is the sense that they've become sort of dislocated from their normal way of being in life with their partner or their family member, whoever it happens to be, and they've lost their sense of sort of forward movement as well. So normally we just assume the future is going to look a certain sort of way, we move in that direction. So one of the things that we also, I think, find quite commonly, we might say people feel stuck, but sometimes it's almost as though people don't even know who they are anymore. And this takes us back into that existential area as well. And so part of what we're helping people do is re-story, as it were, not just who they are now, not just who they want to be in the future, but what actually happened in the past. And many of the first, any number of bereavement counselling sessions with people will be about what happened, where were you, were you there at the death? What did you witness? All of those things. And being able to be very open in a way they can, maybe with a health professional, that they may feel constrained in doing with a family member or friend.
Just listening to both of you talking and explaining this, the word that comes up for me is loneliness.
Oh yeah.
Aloneness. Because it seems like a lot of work, it seems like exhausting work, and in all the aspects that you've covered beautifully, it just seems like a very difficult amount of work to adjust to that loss.
Yeah.
And how that, would look in a new way for that person, or a different way.
I think the word work is really a good one, because it is work. And I think, again, people often feel exhausted. And that's sometimes the result of the fact that they've been caring for a long period of time and been hypervigilant in that care. And even if that hasn't been the case, as you say, the work of grief can be exhausting on every level. It's almost like they've dug in the garden for 6 hours. Yeah. They're physically exhausted. But again, I think, this idea of aloneness is one of the things that does come up, very, very frequently. But, in a way, death is natural. Aloneness is natural. Even though we're kind of designed to be in herds or packs or relationships, we are solitary, we are our own being.
This is a conversation that comes up a lot in bereavement counselling, and people will often differentiate between the two. So being alone is one thing, and that's almost a factual sort of experience that people can come to generally more easily, but the felt sense of a loneliness is a whole other more challenging level of experience. And that more typically will come up for people whose friends appear to have deserted them, or where maybe they were in a relationship where they were not the socially active person and they relied on their partner, whoever it was, to be the socially active person, and they find themselves very alone and lonely. And I just wanted to add to, I was so pleased that you said adjustment and not acceptance, because acceptance is a loaded word in bereavement counselling, and it's a very difficult word. Now, some of our clients will use that word and feel okay about it, but there can be almost like a moral overtone which has the word should in front of it, and that goes back to some of those sayings we were talking about before. There are other people worse off than you. Oh, your husband had a good innings, or something like that.
He was old.
He was old, what do you expect? And that implies the word acceptance. So for myself and for other bereavement counsellors I know, we tend to be very cautious about using that. An adjustment that happens almost in and of itself, even if you don't want it to, is a far safer word to use. And finally, coming back to the conversation before, all the things we mentioned about difficulty in speaking with people as they're going through an acute episode of grief, absolutely also apply for health professionals. And so one of the biggest questions, most common questions I had in running education sessions over the last number of years is something like, what do I say when ... What do I say when somebody's just been told they're about to die, or somebody's just died? And so spending some time thinking about how we might respond, but not necessarily coming up with a prescriptive sentence, is really useful. What do I say when there's nothing I can say? What do I do? And because we love our processes and we love ticking boxes, we're in a situation where that's much harder to do, and witnessing or presencing, to pick up, or being present, to pick up what Patricia was saying, is far more where we need to be at, I think. There's no right answer.
Because I think too, we can't fix this. We actually can't fix the loss. We can't bring the person back. But it's true for any, strong emotion. We can't fix it for ourselves or for another person. The way people say to me, how do I get through this? How do I get through this? And I think really, they want to punch me, I think. But, my response is often, the only way through it is to go through it, is to actually experience it, with the support that you might need, with the self-care that you either can't do or you need to go and find out how to do. It's like you have to go through it, and nothing's wrong. What you're feeling may be unpleasant, unfamiliar. You do not want it to go on for any length of time, but it is not wrong.
For you, what in the work that you're doing with your clients, what might a healthy bereavement look like? How would you describe that?
It's a sort of it's a great question, but it's sort of a problematic question as well. So to cut to the other end of that particular spectrum, there's been a lot of research around what was called pathological grief or complex grief, which is now being called prolonged grief and, of course, disorder. And there's a couple of international measuring tools that are used that agree about the criteria, should people want to look that up. You know, with a lot of provisos, they're saying that if the grief is troubling more so than it might usually be across a cohort or a population after 6 months, then it's prolonged. Does it mean it's pathological? I don't think so. I don't think any bereavement counsellor thinks that either. So to come back to the healthy side of and how we might know if something looks healthy, there's a model that's really quite simple and very easy to have in mind that gives us a bit of a view of bereavement that can really help here. And it's called the dual process model, dual being two. So if we think about a pendulum or a spectrum, at one end we have following a death. We have people who might then be focused on getting back into life, doing the things about going back to work, you know, learning to cook if you didn't do the cooking, mowing the lawn, changing the light bulbs, cultivating new friends. It's the doing aspect, it's the restoration oriented they talk about. At the other end of the pendulum, you have loss oriented. That is people who are much more with the feelings of the loss, the responses to the loss, might be going to the cemetery, doing those memorials and rituals we were talking about, coming to see a bereavement counsellor. So for most people, in many aspects of life where there is an event that happens, we will have a response that moves from engagement, but stepping back as well and taking rest and looking after ourselves. So that movement is something to listen for. It's very healthy. What we would listen for in terms of what might make that more challenging or unhealthy, if you want to use that word, is if people are stuck, sometimes quite willfully, at either end of that spectrum. So at one end, I remember a young bloke who I think was a merchant banker, and his partner of a number of years died. So he just went right down this end of the pendulum and worked harder, played harder, slept less, drank more. Significantly, 3 or 4 weeks later, he was down at the pub, and the significant part being he was talking to a female co-worker. He'd had a few drinks, probably significant as well. And so she turned to him and said, "So what's wrong?" And he just melted and burst into tears. And he came back and he asked me, "What's wrong with me?" Well, he'd been stuck down this restoration doing, and he'd been, in a sense, avoiding, ignoring, putting away, rejecting any of those very natural but very challenging feelings, because what do you do with them? Well, he came to see me and we worked through that a little bit. At the other end of the pendulum, you might have somebody, let's say where a child has committed suicide, even an older child, in the 20s, 30s, 40s. That person might feel that re-engaging with life is wrong, it's morally wrong, that somehow they're accepting, the death, and therefore they will almost willfully, perhaps unknowingly, want to stay with the pain and the suffering and go over why didn't I see it, why didn't I know? And there can be an absolute pushing away and avoidance of the other swing of the pendulum. Now, most people don't get stuck at either end of the pendulum, or if they do, it's fairly moderate or for short periods of time. But if we're listening and we're hearing that people, we'll always play to what we've always done, so we'll notice these patterns in ourselves already. And it might correspond to being an introvert and extrovert as well. Some people need more time and space. Some people need to be doing more. The doing might be about the death. It might be going to the cemetery. It might be building a beautiful Japanese garden for a wife who's died in the front garden. Certainly one of my clients did that in the past. But it can also be about avoidance, an extreme and prolonged avoidance. So that's something to listen out for that gives us a clue about healthy grieving, which has that sort of flow and movement according to who the person is and the death and all those other factors we've talked about.
And people, do, when you get to know them even quite quickly, that they do have quite a bit of insight into what might be happening for them. So they will sometimes notice that that's what's happening, even without giving it a formal name. They'll notice that they're oscillating, if you like, between those places, and sometimes they're questioning, like, well, is the pain the way I stay connected to the person? And then we can talk about this idea of ongoing connection, continuing ways to stay connected with the person, and obviously it would be, photographs talking about the person to other people who loved them, but it might be going to a place that has either significance or you imbue with significance, where you can go and, probably used to be cemeteries and churches, but now it could be, you know, a cliff or a bushwalk or something, you know, just where you imbue that place with the person, where you go and you kind of connect. And I don't mean you kind of commune with them in the seance kind of sense, but you feel with them, you feel open to their presence or their connection, you know. And I guess too, what, you know, just to sort of pick up again on those extremes of the domains of the restoration orientation and the loss orientation, it's not comfortable or sustainable to be in either of those extremes. So it's not really comfortable to live on the edge. So, you know, always, I think, coming in towards the middle, towards some sort of balanced place. And it also makes it tolerable because the oscillations are slightly smaller. So you're not kind of banging into this kind of deep place of grief and misery, and nor are you in this kind of heightened place of distraction and busyness and maybe denial, you know. So it's the middle part.
Just on the word oscillations, a small point, but probably I think an important one. That is that those oscillations between, you know, engagement, avoidance, however you want to phrase it, are quite jagged at the start for many people and involuntary. Hence, we come to anxiety and fear and worry and so forth. But over time there can be a gentling of those oscillations as well. But we need to be prepared, if we're working with people who are grieving, particularly around bereavement, that these things are, you know, sudden, unexpected, and sometimes quite violent too, you know, in terms of an internal experience. But over time they tend to become quite gentle and actually more manageable too. So this is the work of counselling and bereavement counselling.
And do people start to feel, do you think in counselling, do people start to feel a sense of discomfort even around feeling better?
Yes.
Feeling that
Definitely.
they're doing in that swinging, where there's that sense of, you know what, I actually went out and I enjoyed my day.
I didn't think about him for half an hour.
Think of the guilt that comes up with that.
Yes.
So guilt nearly always accompanies that at some stage, to a minor level, but for the people we see perhaps, because of the nature of what we do, it's usually far more obvious. And so that can then lead to further resistance about re-engaging, and so you get that cycle that starts going on there.
A discomfort around
absolutely.
feeling okay or better.
And a shame, you know, I'm betraying their memory, I'm being disloyal. And what kind of happens in a kind of psychic sense is they give that pendulum thing a big whack, and it hits them right back into the desperation, the bleakness, the sadness, the melancholy, you know.
There's a should in there.
Way.
I should be grieving. I shouldn't be getting back to life. And these are the shoulds that we either generate ourselves or we hear from people around us, implied or actually said.
Now, talking about adjustment and that word, I think 2020 is going to be a massive year of adjustment, with a year unfolding. We started with bushfires, with loss of environment, of livelihood, of families, of friendships, of work, and then right on the back of that we've had the COVID situation, which is once again about a sense of your own mortality, a fear, the uncertainty. We're often now sitting, all of us, with the uncertainty that a lot of our patients sit with and a lot of our families sit with. And I'm just wondering if you're following all the catastrophe of this year, do you have a sense of some of the issues coming through, bereavement issues coming through with COVID and the bushfires?
I think at the moment, from my perspective and what I've experienced so far, Joan, the two key experiences, and there are others that follow from this, are isolation. There are three actually. You've already mentioned uncertainty. Isolation, the sense of being separate, cut off, not being able to, you know, physically connect, and that's very true for healthcare workers who might have to wear PPE all the time on the wards. And anxiety. So the uncertainty and anxiety are absolute bedfellows, as we all know. And so the anxiety about what will happen out there, will I get my job back, will I get any money to rebuild my house, all of those things that we all know about. The effect on us as bereavement counsellors, what we're seeing in part, is that people that we might have thought we were more or less going to complete with over a period of time, these issues seem to have exacerbated what they're already feeling, you know, because those feelings are already there and it's just magnified and made them more complex in some ways too. So, for example, if you had a very close relationship with your husband and your husband dies, and you haven't really had a lot of other friends outside of the husband's circle, and now you're isolated at home, you can't see anybody, maybe you were going out once a day to the gym or something like that, you can't do that anymore. That absolutely exacerbates and deepens what people are feeling. Definitely comes out of uncertainty. I think it actually affects healthcare workers as well. We might have less tolerance for uncertainty at work because we're experiencing that ourselves. We just don't know what's happening on the wards necessarily.
And I think, kind of in summary, the idea that losses are now multiple and cumulative for people. It's not just their loss, it's these external things and of course the uncertainty.
And all at once.
There's less support available on every level. They're seeing or they're doing counselling maybe on the phone rather than face-to-face. They haven't had the opportunity to go and join a community choir or an exercise group or whatever they might have been thinking of doing. Sometimes the grief feels like it need to take a back seat, that it's not as important as these other things that are more in your face, and there is that disruption of ritual that we talked about earlier on. But I just wondered if I might quickly read just a little quote from Jane Caro, who's an author and a social commentator, and she was reflecting on the COVID situation, and she said it took her back to 1988 when her infant premature baby was suffering from a life-threatening respiratory condition, and it really was touch and go, and in fact the daughter did survive and is a grown-up now. But where she gets to after some conversations with she says a neonatologist and a grief counsellor all rolled into the one person. What a lovely combination. And I think she came to this place and she says, I stopped trying to control the uncontrollable. I stopped trying to prepare for all the worst things I could imagine. I learned a fundamental truth, that while I can attempt to minimise danger, and may I say death, she didn't say that, I can't make it go away. And I hope when all of this passes, she means the COVID crisis, that we all learn how to accept reality again and recognise that we are all just vulnerable human beings, no more or less important than anyone else. None of us is above the natural world or even separate from it. We are as dependent on it as every other living being, and that's okay.